Now let me ask you a question. If someone stole a bucket from your city, how many people should die because of it? 10? 100? 1,000? For the people living in Europe in the year 1325, the answer was simple. Thousands. And no, this is not a metaphor. This actually happened. In 1325, a war broke out in what we now call Italy. A war that killed thousands of people. Cities were burned, armies marched, families were torn apart. And you know why? Not land, not religion, not a battle for a throne. The reason was a bucket. And as absurd as this story sounds, it is one of the most honest stories ever told about human nature. But don't rush, because this story is much darker than it seems. You need to understand something first. In the Middle Ages, there was no country called Italy. These lands were filled with hostile city-states, constantly at war with one another. Each city had its own army, its own laws, and its own pride. For these cities, war was not extraordinary. It was part of survival. Peace was temporary, tension was permanent. And in the middle of this chaos, two cities stood out in particular: Bologna and Modena. On the map, they were right next to each other. Culturally, they were almost identical. They spoke the same language, yet they hated each other. Because throughout history, the deepest hatred has often existed between those who are the most similar. For years, these two cities had stood on opposite sides. They were local reflections of a massive political conflict dividing all of Europe. Bologna supported the Pope. Modena supported the Holy Roman Emperor. So this was not just a conflict between two cities. It was a small but poisonous fragment of a power struggle shaping the fate of Europe. For years, tensions simmered. Trade routes were blocked, borders were violated, insults were exchanged. But none of it was enough to ignite a full-scale war. Until the moment no one took seriously. One night in 1325, a small group of soldiers from Modena quietly crossed into Bologna's territory. But pay attention, this was not an invasion, this was not an attack, this was not an attempt at conquest. This was something far more dangerous: humiliation. The soldiers walked to a public well in the center of the city, and from there, they took a wooden bucket. That's it. No gold, no sacred relic, no military symbol. Just an ordinary bucket, used by everyone. But everyone understood the message. We can enter your city, we can mock you, and you can't stop us. And that's when the real disaster began. Bologna demanded the bucket back. Not quietly, not politely, officially, publicly, as a matter of honor. And Modena's response changed the course of history. Number. At that moment, there was still a chance to turn back. Reason could have prevailed. Someone could have said, "This is ridiculous." But humans don't decide with reason. They decide with pride. And pride has always been one of the most expensive emotions in history. For Bologna, this was no longer about a bucket. It was about refusing to appear weak. Because in the Middle Ages, a city that appeared weak invited far greater disasters. And so, the decision for war was made. Pause here, because this is where the story becomes even more absurd. Bologna raised an army of nearly 30,000 soldiers. Modena had barely 7,000. The numbers were so unbalanced that this looked less like a war and more like an execution. Everyone expected Bologna to win. But history teaches us this lesson again and again. Numbers often mean nothing when chaos takes over. In 1325, near Zappolino, the battle began. Swords were drawn, horses fell, screams filled the air. and thousands of people who had nothing to do with a bucket, lost their lives that day. People died, families disappeared, cities burned, and then something no one expected happened. Modena won. Yes, the smaller army won, and they celebrated their victory with one of the most ironic symbols in history. They did not return the bucket. Instead, they turned it into a trophy. And now comes the most disturbing part. That bucket is not a legend. It is not a symbolic exaggeration. It still exists today. It is still displayed in Modena, quietly delivering a very clear message. Humanity rarely acts on reason. It acts on pride. And the price is almost always paid by the innocent. This war did not start because of a bucket, but a bucket exposed just how destructive human ego can be. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this: many of today's disasters are still driven by the very same emotion. A small insult, a poorly timed word, an ego that refuses to step back. And the result? Irreversible destruction. That's why this is not just a story about the past. This is the story of humanity. And this is what actually happened in history.